Hello, I'm Kathleen Newman with Maine Historical Society. Welcome to another virtual program. It is March 25th, 2021, and this is Off to Maine, Early Sportsman in the Maine Woods, a talk with Steve Pinkham. Steve Pinkham grew up in Western Maine, hearing old stories of hunting and fishing, and has spent much of his life hiking, paddling, and discovering the many wonderful places in the backwoods of Maine. Having spent the past 10 years searching for articles and books, following up on clues, and spending many hours in libraries and historical societies, he published his first book, Mountains of Maine, in 2009. Selecting from his vast collection for this book, he now spends his time writing and publishing articles and books about the Maine woods from his home in Quincy, Massachusetts. He is the author of now 3 books, Old Tales of the Maine Woods, More Old Tales of the Maine Woods, and Mountains of Maine, Intriguing Stories Behind Their Names. Steve, thank you so much for being with us, and I know that our audience joins me in welcoming you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So we're off to Maine. Maine encompasses half of New England, and the northern half of the Pine Tree State is a blanket of mountains, lakes, rivers, and streams teeming with game and fish. Before the Civil War, only a few individuals ventured into the Maine woods, mainly those with wealth who could take vacations anytime, and others such as ministers, artists, professors, scientists, and writers could make the trip on their sabbaticals and summer vacations. The most common hunting and fishing trips were made in canoes, as that was the easiest way to travel in the vast wooded terrain, which had few passable roads. Next slide. The first roads into the Maine woods, it was the Old Canada Road, which is Route 201 today, goes up through Bingham to Quebec. It was a mail route and a stage route and a market road. And when I say market road, even from Quebec, they meant the farmers would drive their sheep down that road and other roads all the way to Boston to the Brighton market. That was the nearest market to take your sheep. There were none in Maine, and so they had to travel hundreds of miles with those sheep. The roads must have stunk after a while. The Moosehead Road from Bangor went up through Dover, Monson, and Greenville, which was settled in the 1820s, and it was a stage route. The military road went from Bangor to Holton, and that was built for the Rustic War and later became a stage and mail route. And lastly, the airline, which today is Route 9 going over from Bangor to Ellis, that was a stage route that would often encounter wolves, and they would encounter the wolves on these lonely roads. They'd have to outrun them because the wolves wanted those horses. Next slide, please. So how did people get there? Well, you could take a schooner from Boston to Bangor, and you were going down east or against the east wind. That's how we get the name down east. And that could go fast if the winds were in your favor, or it could slow down if you weren't. And then railroads came in. The Boston and Maine Railroad came in to Maine in 1844 and came to the area around Augusta and Waterville, and then later Bangor. And within a decade, new roads began reaching north to Bethel, Farmington, the Kennebec Valley, Monson, and Brownville. And by 1897, trains could get to Rangeley, Kineo, Brownville Junction, Fort Kent, and Ellis. And here's a comparison. In 1857, Thoreau took a schooner to Bangor, then a stagecoach to Greenville. That took about 16 hours on that stagecoach to get to Greenville. In 1864, James Russell Lowell, a Harvard professor of literature, took a train from Boston to Waterville, then a stagecoach to Newport. But they had to stop because one of the wheels broke, and they had to get a fence post from a nearby fence, whittle that out, and make a new spoke, and then they were off to Newport, and then off to Greenville in a mud wagon that took a total of 18 hours. So you can see it wasn't easy to get into the Maine woods. Next slide, please. The earliest visitors to the Maine woods would then take stagecoaches to Rangeley and to Moosehead. Once there, they would be transferred across the lakes in sailboats. So again, that would depend on the wind patterns to get you over across Rangeley Lake or up Moosehead Lake. But within a very short time, steamships came in because steam engines got smaller and were able to function on boats. Next one. So the Union was the first steamship on the Rangeley Lakes. It was on Lake Umbagog over on the New Hampshire border. And that eased up everything because now you didn't have to depend on the wind to get somewhere. And so they had that one. They had them on each of the lakes. Charles Farrar set up a system on the Richardson Lakes. Captain Barker set up a steamship company on Moosehead, and others set up Rangeley ones. And then Moosehead also had them, and they still have the Katahdin, which they could also use for lumber as well as getting people up to Kineo. And then you would get to a certain point, you would have to take a buckboard or a wagon. And a buckboard has large springs, and people would ride in them for about 5 minutes, and then they would get out and walk. Because whenever they went over a rock, that thing bounced and you would go flying. So most accounts we have of people taking buckboards, they walked. Next slide, please. And then lastly, to get into the most remotest places, you would have to get into a canoe to go across a lake to camps or down rivers to the camps. And lastly, if it was even more remote, you had to pack in and walk and bring everything with you. But they didn't always bring a lot of food because they could fish and hunt and supply food for themselves. The last the canoeing problems was the carries, because oftentimes you'd have all that gear and you would have to carry them across from one lake to another or one river system to another river system. And the two most famous carries in the Maine woods was the mud pond carry, was how you got onto the Allagash in the early days by going up to Chosun and then cutting across. And then the Ripogenus carry on the West Branch, which is about 4 miles long and took a long time to get everything back and forth across that one. Next slide. Okay, the two most visited places in Maine were the Rangeley Lakes region and the Moosehead Lake region. Where dozens of hotels and sporting camps opened to meet the demand. Rangeley afforded great fishing where trout were, you could have, in the early days, you had trout reaching 25 pounds in weight that could be caught, as well as the rare aquasa, which is a blueback trout, and for which Rangeley Lake is named, Aquasic Lake. This is the root word for that lake. Moosehead was noted more for its large salmon fishing and its beautiful surroundings and the beautiful Mount Kineo. Next slide. Now I'm going to show you the oldest hotels and camps from each of the regions of Maine. Now these two are the oldest out there that are still operating. The Sterling Inn in Caratunk on Route 201 in the town of Caratunk opened in 1816. So it has been open continuously for 205 years, and you can still stay there. The Shin Pond House at Shin Pond on the east side of Katahdin has been open 130 years. So these are two of the oldest inns that have been continuously open. There are others like Kineo and stuff and Chosun, which are gone now. So they burnt down. And that was the usual fate of a lot of old hotels, was fire. The Sterling Inn, Ralph Sterling later built some sporting camps down on the Kennebec River across from it to go with his establishment. And the Shin Pond House is located between Upper and Lower Shin Ponds on the way to the north end of Baxter State Park. Next one. Now, over in Rangeley, Camp Henry was opened by George Soule on Rangeley Lake in 1846, and we have a sketch of it. Later, it was added as an L to the back of the Mountain View House. And George Soule and his wife went to work there. She cooked and he took care of the boats and things for a few years before their retirement. Anglers Retreat is now known as Middle Dam Camps, and they're still open. And Joshua Rich opened those in 1860. They've gone through a couple name changes, but today they are Middle Dam Camps, and can still be stayed at. And those are the oldest actual sporting camps still open in the state of Maine. Next one. In the Dead River region, Tim Pond camps were opened in 1878 by Kennedy Smith. They're still open. And King and Bartlett was opened the following year by O.A. Hutchins. First, he had to get a road into King and Bartlett before he could even offer to get people in there. So they had to build that in the fall of 1878 and opened just about in time for some hunting. Tim Pond camps, it's interesting because Kennedy Smith, he ran those for about 10 years and then he retired and he couldn't get it out of his system. He went up to Round Mountain Pond, which is above Eustis now, and opened up some more camps and ran them for a few years and then sold those. Some of these guys just couldn't get it out of their system. Harry Pierce took over the King of Bartlett camps, and he ran those for 32 years. So, and today they are privately owned. They're still with us, but they're privately owned. Next slide, please. On the Kennebec River region, the two oldest were the Parlin House, which opened in 1862 by James Sylvester. Now, there was a small place called the Adams Place or the Burgoyne Place on that road because it was a halfway point between the Forks and Moose River. And you had to have some place to stop, water the horses, and maybe get food for the people that were in your stagecoach or on the route. But James W. Sylvester built it in 1862 as a grand hotel. And again, that got built a couple times too. The Carey Pond camps, which are on East Carey Pond, or what's called Carey Pond, just across from Bingham, were built first as a private camp. They were the headquarters of the Arnold Trail Club in the 1870s. And Mr. Ellis of Bingham opened them up by 1880 as Carey Pond camps. And those are private today as well. Next slide, please. Now we move up to Moosehead Lake, so we're getting further up in the Maine Woods. The Kineo House was opened in 1848 by Joshua Fogg, and that went through about 4 times burning and being rebuilt. And every time they rebuilt it, it would be bigger and bigger. And it was big enough. So at the end of it, they actually had 100 guides there when people arrived that you could hire, because the guides didn't work for the camp. They actually worked for themselves, but the camps and the hotels would have to have a bunkhouse for them to keep them and feed them. That was part of the deal. So it's an interworking relationship between the proprietors and the guides. The Wilsons at West Outlet House was opened in 1865, and that is still open. It was in the Wilson family for over 150 years, but now it's a new family owns it. But you can still stay there, and that goes back to 1865. It had a main house, and it had cabins, and today the cabins are left. Next slide, please. The oldest camps on the Pleasant River. Now, this is the Patheticus region. West Branch Pond camps were opened in 1881 by Charlie Randall, and those are still open today, and owned by a family that's had them over 100 years now, been running them, that family. And they are on West Branch Pond, which is northwest of the Roach River, or northwest of Moosehead Lake. The Little Lyford Pond camps were opened by Phil Randall, the father of Charlie Randall. And now they're opened by the Appalachian Mountain Club, who purchased them, and has 3 sets of camps now. They have Metawisla, north of West Branch Pond camps, and then they have one south of Little Lyford Pond at Long Pond, the Gorm and Chairback camps. So they have 3 sets of camps, but you can stay at 4 of them because you can actually call the West Branch Pond camps. And if they have room, they'll put you up for a fee. And you can do a walk and have a place to sleep and eat at night on that whole trip. Next slide. On the West Branch, the Chosun House was there by itself for many, many, many years. Because most of the camps, of which there were dozens and dozens of them on the lower West Branch in the Twin Lakes region, didn't get built until the Bangor to Rustic Railroad got built to what we call Norcross Station at the foot of Twin Pond, just below Millinocket, in the 1890s. So most of those camps didn't open until about 1897. But the Chosun House goes way back. Unfortunately, that burnt in 2018. So that's no longer with us. And that was one of the oldest, opened in 1860 by Joe Morris, who later had a farm on the West Branch at Northeast Cary, across from, on the other side, on the Penobscot side of Moosehead Lake. So he had this, and then he went up there. Later, Joe Smith and then Ansel Smith ran the Chosun House for many, many years. And it was open for 158 years when it burned. Next slide, please. Now, the East Branch of the Penobscot. The Hunt Farm opened in 1831 by William Hunt. He'd moved over there from Peru in Oxford County and bought the land along the East Branch and it was choice because it was flat, relatively flat, so he could build the fields, open the fields up, so he could have hay to sell to the lumbermen that needed the hay for their horses and cattle, oxen, to do the work. It later was taken over by Madison Tracy. That's the M.M. Tracy you see, and he named it the Matagamon House. Matagamon is actually a lake north of there, the East Branch. It's a set of lakes above Shin Pond, but he used that name, Matagamon. And Madison Tracy was interesting because the Tracy family came from Calais, and they came over there to lumber first, and they were lumbering in what is now Baxter State Park. It wasn't then. They were lumbering on the north side of Katahdin, and so they used this farm a lot, and eventually Madison took it over and ran it. Further up the East Branch was the Lungsu's House, which opened in 1881 by Luther Rogers. And you can see on the bottom these horses. Well, the Lungsu's House was very unique in its shape, one of the most interesting ones, overlooking the river. But he had stables and he had horses because they were pack horses, because that became the favored way to get up Katahdin by the 1880s. Prior to that, most people went down the West Branch and up the Katahdin and then back out down to Bangor. But in 1855, Everett Edward Hale took this route, was the first one with Ellery Channing. Hale was actually later president of Harvard, and Channing was a writer and a transcendentalist. And they did the hike from this end, and that kind of opened it up, and more people did it from that point. Next slide, please. Now, northern Maine. Now, again, northern Maine is like the West Branch in the sense that only a few places opened up before 1897. Because again, they had to wait until that train got there, because getting up to Rustic County was just too difficult for most people. There was a hotel, the Oxbow House, built in 1849 in Oxbow Plantation, which is a spur off of Route 11. And that burnt in 2016, so that's gone now. Will Atkins opened his camps, had some at Millinocket Lake and he had some at Moosehead Lake. And those were well-known. He was a well-known person. He opened those up in 1881. And that was 16 years before any other camps opened up in that region. So he was way out there first, and he was a well-known guide. Next slide. And that's lastly, when you talk about the Maine Woods, we also include down east, because that was a big fishing and hunting areas as well. The interior of Washington County and part of Hancock County. John Hayne, he built his camps at Alligator Lake in 1885. And he built them, we don't have a picture of them, but if you can see this map, you see Alligator Lake, and it was named for its shape. Well, actually, the peninsula that you can see at the very top of Alligator Lake, you see it coming north and south, cutting across. He had his camps right in the middle of that. It was named Alligator Lake because one time a person went from his camps from that area in their canoe across, and when they looked back at that isthmus, it was the shape of an alligator. And that's how Alligator Lake got its name. Weatherby's in Grand Lake Stream went through a number of changes. The problem with Grand Lake Stream is it was a tannery. And if you know anything about tannic acid, it destroys plants and fish and everything. So they had a big tannery because they had a lot of hemlock trees there at Grand Lake Stream. But once the tannery business was over, in 1887, it took a while for Mother Nature to bring back the river. In 1887, Mrs. T.C. Sims opened up her house, calling it the White House. Not for the capital here, but because it was white. It changed names a number of times. It became the Birches, Ball's Camps, and then finally Weatherby's, which it is today. So those have been open since 1887, that house. I have kept a spreadsheet of all the camps I've been able to find in Maine through all my research. And you're probably not going to believe this, but I have found over 732 camps in Maine from 1860, or actually from 1816 to the present. Next slide, please. Okay, so how did people find out about how to get to Maine? Because people came from Boston, Worcester, Hartford, Philadelphia, and New York. They would come to Maine because it was the best fishing around. So the magazines, at first there were just a few guidebooks that you could look at. And those were regular guidebooks, but they helped. And the railroads put out some guidebooks too, but they didn't have the information about where to fish. They just had information on how to get there on the railroads to a certain point. After that, you had to work it out. But once these magazines started in 1870, American Sportsman, which then became the Rod and Gun, ran for 7 years. And then the Forest and Stream, which was the big magazine, and that ran from 1874 to 1930. And then you can see there are many other magazines that came through, outdoor magazines. And don't worry, you don't have to copy these down, because this is, again, this will be put on Maine Historical's website for you to watch anytime you want, if you want to go back and look at these lists. You can always contact me, because I can help you find them and stuff. Next one, please. Okay, now guidebooks. Many, but not all of them, but most of them can actually be found on internetarchive.org and hathitrust.org. Those two websites have a lot of old books, and you can go to those websites and just put in Maine Guidebooks or the name of the books, and they will come up. And you can read them right online. You can download them as PDFs and print them. Or you can do anything you want with them to find them. Many of the old maps that went with the guidebooks can be seen on websites at Osher Map Library at USM, Hawthorne Library at Bowdoin, Boston Public Library, Tulsi Library at Harvard, Hawthorne, I got Bowdoin in there twice, I see now, New York Public Library, and Library of Congress. And you can go right to their websites, put in for their map room, and they've scanned many of these maps, and they're free to look up, and you can make them larger and look at them and discover all kinds of things. There's also a site for old topo maps. Next. So Rangeley had two guidebooks. The first one was built by Charles Farrar. He lived in Jamaica Plain, down here near me, south of, as part of Boston now. And he made his first guide in 1876, and he went through 14 editions, because he would update it about every other year. And many of those are, again, on the websites, and they're full of information and pictures. He tended to put pictures in his. The other guys didn't. Samuel Farmer, he also had a small guidebook, about 68 pages. And that wasn't as detailed as Farrar's, but Sam Farmer was an entrepreneur. He started out running a hotel, which became the Greenvale House at one point, in Rangeley. Then he went down to Phillips, south of there, on the Sandy River, and he ran the Barden Hotel for many, many years. Was very popular proprietor and very adventurous man. He ended up moving to Oklahoma in the end. Next one, please. Maps of the Rangeley region. So this is a list of maps that I've been able to find and collect. Farrar's map of Rangeley, and then there's the Rumford Falls line made a map. G.W. Morris of Portland, he was a publisher. He made a Sportsman's map. George W. Walker was a map maker. He made one of Rangeley and Mechanic District, which is north of Rangeley. And then R.C. Bradford made one in 1902 as well for the Rangeley Lakes territory. Many of those maps are, again, on those websites, and you can look at them. They're fascinating to look at. Next slide. Guidebooks for the Dead River region, which is just east of Rangeley. Arthur Robinson, he was a printer, a publisher from Boston. He put together a guidebook in 1884. He actually published it to 1886, which I forgot to put in there. But he did a couple editions of it. And then Heber Bishop, who worked with Arthur Robinson, they were some of the first members of the Mechanic Fish and Game Club, which still exists and has a huge reserve in the upper part of Rangeley and Dead River. You probably remember hearing about Mechanic because a couple years ago, a train came down into the town of Mechanic and had a huge explosion. You probably remember hearing that. And they had a big, beautiful lodge on Spider Lake right there where that train wreck happened. So he created his book on Mechanic, Spider, and Dead River region and maps with each of them. Those are a little harder to find, but I have copies of them if you ever want to know any information about them. Next one, please. Okay, maps of the Dead River. So Arthur Robinson, he created one for his book. Heber Bishop, Walter Coffin did that one. And Farrar did a map of the Dead River region, and Marshall Tidd created those. Marshall Tidd was a cartographer, map maker from Waltham, Massachusetts. And let's see. So he was very closely related to all the people in Boston and knew them. So that's how they could work together. Farrar created a new map with him. And then a map of the Dead River was by Harry B. Coe. Harry Coe made a lot of maps at that time. And then Snow and Humphreys produced a map a year later of the Upper Kennebec and Moosehead Lake regions. Next one. And lastly, guidebooks for Moosehead Lake in northern Maine. John Way, he was quite a character. He was from Boston, young man, and he traveled all over the Maine woods. I found a number of stories about him. Traveling in the winter, he didn't care what time of the year it was. He was just wanted to find new places. So he was able to create a map, the first map of Moosehead Lake in northern map that we had. Prior to that, when you look at old maps of the Moosehead region, that lake takes many, many shapes. Each map seemed to be different than the previous map because they never could get it straight on the shape of Moosehead Lake, which is kind of shaped like a bunch of antlers. And then Farrar, who was again from Rangeley, also created a guide to Moosehead Lake and vicinity as well. Next one, please. And the other person was Lucius Hubbard, and he created a guide to Moosehead Lake in northern Maine in 1897. Now, because 1883, he went to northern Maine and he made a long canoe trip through the Rustic River and some of the other rivers, wrote a long account about it in this book called Woods and Lakes of Maine. But the most unique thing about this book is the index in the back. He recorded all the Native American, the Wabanaki names of all the lakes because he had the guides to tell him what the names were. And he went also over to Old Town and worked with people over there, as Fanny Hardy Ekstrom did later in the next century. But he left us with a very long list of lakes with their Wabanaki names and what they mean. Because I discovered one day, I hadn't thought about it a lot, and I had an aha moment. I was reading an account. The men who went to Maine and the men and women that went to Maine always wanted to have a map with them to figure out where they're going. The Wabanaki guides did not use maps. Now, they knew these trips by heart, but also many of these lakes have literal meanings. A lake's name could mean outlet at 2 sandbars. And so just by knowing the name of that lake, he knew the information he needed to find that outlet on that canoe trip. So they had in their language a description of everything. We only use it occasionally in English, and we often hyphenate the words like in the woods or in our language. Next one, please. So the Sportsman's maps of Moosehead and Northern Maine. You can see the list here. You John Way, Farrar, and Hubbard all created theirs. Walker did another one. Rand Avery, which was around for a long time. Frank D.T. Sanders, who had a store up at Greenville. Sanders' store was there for well over 100 years, and it was the place to get all your gear before heading out onto the lake and up to Kineo and where else you were going. And then in 1906, Mullaney created the Sportsman Lumberman's Map of Maine. Next one. Okay, now the railroads advance. So you remember, this was how they got there in the early days. They could get as far as Waterville, Augusta, maybe Bangor by rail, and then maybe Bethel. But later, more and more railroads got built, and spurs began off other railroads, getting up into the lakes, and you could finally get up into Rangeley Lake. And this was the Rumford Falls Railroad to Bemis. And that is a picture of Bemis, and that is the only known, was the only known log cabin style railroad station in America. And when they opened, the day they opened this up, Fly Rod Crosby took the first ride on that train and described the whole thing for us. So we have that, her experience. It opened up access to Lake Moosehead, making the Rangeley steamship coming across Rangeley Lake to it no longer necessary. The Sandy River Railroad, also known as the Phillips Railroad, and the railroad was extended from Phillips to Rangeley. It had to make a wide arc through Reddington and around to Rangeley. But finally, you could just get on a train and go to Rangeley itself, what we call Rangeley City, or the village, and making the stage ride from Phillips no longer necessary. So one thing superseded another and put other people out of business. Next slide, please. Now, railroads to Moosehead. The Canadian Pacific and Bangor and Patheticus railroads went to Greenville Junction. They were building the Bangor and Patheticus Railroad from Bangor up through Dover to Monson to Abbott and to get to Greenville. And before it actually got finished, the Canadians had already started building the Canadian Pacific across from Megantic and came down the West Branch and then down to Greenville. And so these two decided to meet at a junction, and that is Greenville Junction today. This is the old railroad station. It's still there. They're trying to save. But that's Greenville Junction when those two railroads came together. So now you could just easily get to Bangor and then another one right to Greenville that way. The Somerset Railway, that one actually started in Oakland because you could transfer off the Maine Central Railroad onto another track and go from Oakland up to 201, right up through Bingham. It went to Anson at first. For a long time it stayed there, but then they finally built it up through Bingham, up through Moscow. And this is the trestle that was there. And there's still people alive who went across that trestle. It was there for a long time. And on its way to Moxie Pond, and then right up the backside of Squaw Mountain and right up to Kineo. So it advanced that much that you could finally get directly to Rockwood. Next slide, please. Okay, and our last ones over on the northern part. In the north, it was the Bangor and Rustic Railroad that opened up. They built it in the 1890s. It basically got opened about 1897. And many, many camps opened as this thing got built, because finally the train could get there, because they'd put an engine on each end so it could go as far as it could without turning around. But they could just shut that engine down, walk to the back of the train, start that engine, and take it back down to Bangor. This one, but this had actually, a branch went to Katahdin Works, a branch went up Route 11 to Fort Kent, another branch went to Holton, all the way to Madawaska. And they had a lot of branches. And that was open for quite a long time. Then down east, again, it was hard to get down east, either going that stagecoach across the airline or going by ship to get there. But finally, in 1898, the Maine Shoreline Railway was opened up between Brewer and Calais. And it went down along the coast. And places like Cherryfield and Machias, you could get off there. And there were people who owned camps in the lakes north of there in Washington County, and they would take you by buckboard or stage even north from the coast into those lakes. And that opened up a number of those lakes, like the Cranberry Lakes, the Greeley Lakes, and others, and Medibemps. Next one, please. Now, how else did they learn about these places to go? Now, we originally showed you those sporting magazines. A lot of people would get those sporting magazines and they would read them because there would be accounts in there of people going to different camps, going to different lakes and stuff, and you could use those basically as a guidebook. And that's what a lot of people did in the early days before those guidebooks got created. They would just simply use the articles written in the newspapers, in the early magazines. But then they started having sportsman shows in Boston and in New York. And this is a picture of the New York Sportsman Show, 1897. And there's an interesting thing about this. You can see every year Maine had a cabin. This is Camp Aquasic, the name of Rangeley Lake. But Fly Rod Crosby, she started out in Phillips, a young woman. She worked in a bank, but she had breathing problems because she had been raised with a coal stove, from that she had. So the doctor said, go up into the Rangeley, go up to the lakes and get fresh air. And that was the usual cure for that. And she tried to figure out what to do, but she could write. She'd gone to school. And so she became a correspondent and started writing about everything that was happening at the lakes. When a new camp opened, she'd go to the camps and interview the people and write a long article about it to promote them. And she became the #1 promoter of the Maine Woods. There's a book out by Earl Shuttleworth and Julia Hunter on her life. I even found recently that she climbed Mount Katahdin. And I have that article that she wrote and about her trip. So when you went to these sports shows, that's where you could meet the guides, you could meet the proprietors, you could pick up pamphlets and everything, go home and then write to people and say, I'm coming on this date, I'm bringing this many people, and off you'd go and pay them when you get there. Now, the way the guides worked actually was they would work for the camps. They didn't work for the camps, they would work with the camps. So all the camps, you would have a lake up in Maine. Maybe you had a camp on this end and you had another sporting camp on the other end. Well, nobody could literally hog the system, in other words. If this first camp on the west end knew that he had 8 people coming and that 8 people wanted guides, he'd have to find 8 guides. So he'd go send somebody over by canoe over to the other one and say, okay, I have these people coming, I need 8 of them. So you've got 5, and then he'd have to go to another lake and find 3 more, or right to Bangor, or and get more guides for everybody, because a lot of them would want their own guide. The cost for a guide was $1 a day in 1900. But then what would happen is now the other camp, the next week, he's got 12 people coming. He needs those guides back. So this kept the guides in business, these camps. And then what would happen is these men would find a guide and they'd like this guide a lot. He'd like what he could show them and teach them and where he could take them and everything. And that guide would get the rights and he'd go into another pond and build a camp of his own. Then he'd contact these men because he'd get their address and write to them and say, next time you come to Maine, you can come to my camp. And this is how camps grew, because most of the proprietors were actually guides first. Next. Okay, sporting camp statistics. The oldest woods hotel I told you was the Kineo House, 1816, now the Sterling Inn. The oldest sporting camp, there's the oldest sporting camps I told you about, Angler's Retreat and Wilson's. The longest proprietor to run a camp that I can find is Mike Marr at Indian Pond. Indian Pond is part of the Kennebec between Moosehead Lake and the Forks. He took over those camps when he was like 18 years old. He came from Canada and he ran them 59 years. He's way out there. There's some people that ran places 40 years, but he ran these camps almost 60 years. And he was in his 80s when he gave up finally. The second longest proprietor was John Haynes of Alligator Lake, who ran them for over 45. And then Billy Soule, he had camps called Pleasant Island camps over Moosehead Lake and Rangeley that he ran for many years and got tired of that. And he sold those off and he went up to northern Maine and built some more camps and ran those for more time. And so with the total, he ran those for 42 years. So to date, we found over 800 Maine hotels, camps, and retreats in the Maine Woods. I put on the first one 732, but I realize it's now over 1,800 when I keep working on it. Next one, please. Rangeley guides, well-known Maine guides. So this is just a list of a few well-known guides from the earlier years. John Ellis was easily Maine's first guide. He was at Moosehead. He went there when he was 18 years old in 1804, and he trapped. Later in 1850, he's then in his 70s, he's listed as a hunter in the census. And a hunter was someone who would go out, shoot moose, bear, deer, caribou, whatever, and then go to the back of the hotel and sell it to the cooks. Because remember, there was no refrigerated trains at that time, there were no vehicles. And so they had to get meat to make those meals for the guests. And the hunters would supply them. I have found hunters at Dead River and Rangeley as well, listed as hunters. And that was their job, to just go out, supply meat for the market. Nathan Moore was an early Kennebec guide, and I have a lot of articles about him. And John Burroughs, the famous naturalist from New York, actually went to Maine and used Nathan Guide as his guide, and he wrote a book called, I'll think of the name in a minute, it's the Birchwood Journal, Birch Journal, there we go. And it tells us all about Nathan Moore. George Soule was the first one over at Rangeley. Joe Francis was one of the oldest West Branch guides. Nathan Bennett and McGalloway, Charlie Randall, Patheticus, Kennedy Smith, and Fly Rod. Now again, Fly Rod was not actually a guide. She never really actually guided anyone. She was a promoter, but she brought so many people into Maine that when the guide service got created in late 1890s, they gave her badge number 1. So badge number 1 of all the guides went to a woman. A lot of people don't know that. However, she wasn't the first to guide. The actual first guide to be certified for a woman was Mabel Harlow of Dead River. And she actually did take people on fishing and hunting trips. Next one, please. And lastly, not quite last, but these are this is just a list of some of the early noted visitors that came to Maine. Charles Landman was an artist and explorer. He went to Rustic and Moosehead. Edward Everett Hale, president of Harvard University, climbed Katahdin in 1845. Henry David Thoreau climbed it the next year. Thomas Winthrop was an explorer. He visited Rangeley. He kept a journal. And he actually traveled all the way out to Oregon and kept a journal of all that. But unfortunately, he died in the Civil War in 1861. He was one of the first to go south, officers, and was shot at one of the first battles. Frederick Church was a well-known artist. He visited the West Branch and climbed Katahdin, and he had a camp at Millinocket Lake, below the town of Millinocket. James Russell Lowell, a Harvard professor, visited Moosehead Lake and left us a lot of description. Teddy Roosevelt climbed Katahdin in 1879. And we don't have an account of it, but we do have a letter that he sent to his future wife, who was his actually distant cousin, that he talked about his climbing Katahdin at that time. He actually lost one of his shoes, his moccasins, and he did it one barefoot, climbed Katahdin. John Burroughs, the naturalist I told you about, he visited Pleasant Pond to Caratunk and wrote a long article about it. Next one. That's it. So just a little bit at the end. At first, only men went to Maine. And then about the 1880s, women started going to Maine and coming with them. And camps opened up and started offering things for the families, because they would actually bring children after that, whole families. And they would have picnics for them. They would have mountain climbing or a local mountain to climb, croquet sets. They had everything they needed to keep them happy while the men went out fishing. So that is my presentation. We can take questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was great. I really appreciate it. And folks, if you have questions for Steve, please type those into the chat or into the Q&A. I'd like to get us started with the questions. Steve, do you have a story that's a personal favorite from what you've discovered in your research, something that you think is particularly interesting or of note?
Yes, there were actually two storytellers in Maine, well-known storytellers. There was one from Rangeley, Ed Grant was his name, and actually a fisherman came up there from Philadelphia. He was a publisher, and he actually collected Ed Grant's stories and published them in 1904. I have a copy of that. And then later in 1962, some more people put together his stories. And then there was Dudley, who was up at Katahdin. He was a warden, and he was a great storyteller, and we have his stories as well. They were recorded on a dictaphone that somebody carried all the way up to Chimney Pond to record him. Those weighed about 18 pounds back then. But Ed Grant left us a wonderful story called The Team Drought. And I've gone all around Maine telling these stories with my books. And that's the one I always start with because it's a great story. The tall tale.
Alan is asking, I think appropriately, since you just mentioned books, Is all of this info or a lot of what you related in a book? Is it maybe in one of the books that you've written? And also Alan says, thank you for the great talk.
You're welcome. No, actually, the book on the mountains is simply about the mountains, how they get named. That it's not a guide. It's actually a book about a lot of folklore and history of the mountains. The other two books I have are collections of the best stories out there. I sifted through all the stories and picked out the best ones. So I don't have not created a book that tells this kind of story, although there's something I've been thinking about as a general overview.
And of course, if you're interested in this particular information, this talk is being recorded and will be available on our website, mainehistory.org. You'll be able to see not only this program, but all of our past virtual programs. And our website is also, too, a great place to learn about Maine Historical Society, our exhibits, how you can become a member, how you can visit. So if you'd like to revisit any of the information that Steve has gone over tonight, don't forget that this program is going to be available on our website in a couple weeks. Another question that I have, Steve, and for folks that are interested in your books and in your work, I've put the link to your website in the chat, oldtalesofthemainewoods.com, correct?
Correct.
So folks can learn more about the work that you've done and the work that you're doing by visiting that website. Another question that I have, what do you think? We've learned a lot tonight about the history of sportsmen and recreation and guides and travel in Maine. What do you think the future is for this type of recreation in the state? Are things changing? And if so, how?
Yes, there are still probably about 35 or 40 camps still open in Maine. I know this pandemic has taken a toll on some of them financially because they're seasonal. And but I do know that a lot of people in Maine have been attending going to some of the camps because they could without going when it was restricted, so you couldn't go out of state. A lot of people in Maine would go to these camps, so they kind of kept them in business. But a lot of them are just now opening up, and they're going to do, the social distancing, all that. They'll spread out their dining rooms, and they'll do everything they need to do, and you'll be out in the open most of the time, so it'll be a safe place for people to go.
Well,
so hope they make it.
I mean, it's certainly, as we've learned, this evening, enjoying the outdoors and hunting and fishing and hiking. It's a great tradition in Maine. So it's one that certainly I think we're all hopeful that 2021 there'll be more opportunities to enjoy Maine's recreation and the great outdoors in Maine. And it's good to hear that people will be thinking of how can we do that? How can we continue to do that? And how can we continue to do it safely and continue to keep those traditions alive?
There are two, when you go to sporting camps, there's two different types of sporting camps. There is American plan and housekeeping plan. And in a housekeeping plan, you get a cabin with a kitchen, pots and pans, towels, everything, and you bring your own food and you do your own cooking. Those are a lot less expensive, good for a lot of families. If you want to pay more, you can go to the American plan, and there you get all 3 meals as well as so you don't have to do any cooking. You just wait for the dinner bell to ring and go into a wonderful dinner. So you can pick either one. There are both kinds, and there's something for everybody. And some of them are easy to get to, and some of them are very remote.
Mm-hmm.
But now with the Golden Road and many of those roads open, you can drive to them.
our options are much more comfortable now.
Right.
Maybe
It
than
doesn't take
they were
16 hours.
200 years ago, right?
It doesn't take 16 hours to go to Moosehead Lake from
Right,
here.
right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. This was a lovely evening, and I think a perfect way for us to start start the spring as we start to enjoy better weather, and as we start to enjoy, I hope, better times in Maine in 2021. Thank you so much for sharing your work and your expertise with us this evening. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the audience before we close?
You've got my website. You can contact me through my website. If you have any questions about the history of Maine, I'd love to hear from you, work with you, share with you. I can find stuff for you. I always learn from people, and we'll just learn more and more. So that's the way you can get a hold of me, through my website.
Fantastic. And that is, again, folks, oldtalesofthemainewoods.com. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being with us. I hope we'll see you back for another virtual program with Maine Historical Society soon.